One. I'm gonna have to do Bible class a little bit different this evening, and we'll deal with it. Not that I haven't done it this way I do my podcast. We had a little technical problem, so we're we have everything running pretty good. So we're studying the life of David. If you would like to go and open up your Bibles over to 1 Samuel chapter 11. I have up there, chapter 11 and 12, but we're probably going to get through 11 for sure, and then I want to spend some time on chapter 12. There's some material in there that I think that is going to be much better if I was able to kind of keep it to where it's in its own context. So, as we continue in this, it's last week we saw how David had been securing up the kingdom and getting everything and all the enemies lined up and all the problems that that he's been dealing with militarily, and some of the things that he's had to deal with is just the external politics of nations around him and dealing with the nation of Ammon. And Ammon, last week we looked in pretty good depth about the idea of how the king had died, and David was he was showing some very good political savvy and also sincerity, that he did appreciate the king of Ammon. His son took over, and so he wanted to express his sympathy, so he sends dignitaries there to express that for him. When they arrive, the advisors to the new king of Ammon is very skeptical about the motivation behind why they're there. They tell the king, do you think he really cares about your dad dying? They're here to spy us out. I mean, so, you shouldn't put up with this. This is ridiculous. So they shave their beards. They strip off the upper tunics, their clothes, basically, and humiliate them. And in that, they bring war and the wrath of David down upon them, and just a whole lot of things that Ammon tried to scramble and try to protect themselves by hiring the Syrians to come down, and that didn't work out. Joab, being a pretty brilliant commander himself, was able to outwit them, and no matter how many times the Syrians tried to come down and attack, they were defeated. So we come to a point in this story that like I said, chronologically, it's a little difficult to keep things straight because we're moving between the book of Samuel as well as looking over. Oh, thank you. You know what? I forgot to. Okay, there. I had all the mics turned on except for one downstairs. We do have some people here with me in the building. I'm just having to be upstairs. So thank you for letting me know about that, Rhett. Hello, Carol and Eileen. We're glad to have you with us. But you can hear me okay, right, Becky?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, back to my story. So in this confrontation between Ammon and all of that conflict, we find this complacency. David starts to change, and it's a point in his life that is starting to show where he's allowing his weaknesses, his lust, to overcome him. And so during this engagement, only one time we see goes out, and he after Joab is encircled and they've started this engagement with the city itself of Rabab, the capital of Ammon, and he goes out and he intercedes with another Syrian force come down. But after that, he seems to be hanging out back in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of events that go on, and we found last week we looked at the idea that they came back. And so like we talked about, Becky, you'd brought up in class about the idea of how you have a season for the kings, good weather fighting, right? That you have a time that you fight and there's a time that you don't. And so we found that there's a period, as the scriptures lay it out, where they have come back. And so there's a period of about a year at least that goes by before then Joab once again proceeds back down into the territory of Ammon, and he engages and starts really just tearing up the area, burning, pillaging, and then he encircles the city. it's during this time that we see that the transgressions and what happens between David and Bathsheba. Um, it's really hard to hold exactly, find out how many years, how much time went in between these, but there's significant amount of time, enough to where there's probably a year and a half or so that do go by from the time that they encircle Ammon, and by the time that David and Bathsheba, and then the fall of the city of Ammon that finally does occur. So let's go ahead and look. And, I think that the very first verse really kind of sets it off and showing, that this is the problem. This is what was David's biggest downfall. In verse 1, in the spring of the year, the time that when kings would go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. So that right there is starting to show us right away that David, he's not where he should be. And there, it's not that a king had to always be there, but at the end of chapter 12, we see where Joab, when the city falls, before it falls, he sends a message back saying, hey, you need to get down here. This is where you should be, because of the impression with the troops and everybody that the king wouldn't be present, so it would give more glory to Joab, which I thought was an interesting character of Joab's loyalty to David is complex. And like I said, I describe him as kind of he would be the General Patton, the guy that wasn't very couth, but a very brilliant military commander. So now, while he's back in Jerusalem, we see that this is where he is sitting around the house and he gets in trouble, starting in verse 2 and 3. And it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and he was walking on the roof of the king's house. And he saw from a roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and he inquired about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So when we look at who is Uriah, and that he's in battle, he's not at home. Uriah in 2 Samuel chapter 23:39, in chapter 39, we see this list of the mighty men of David. Those mighty men started out with David at the very beginning in the what you call the cave of Adullam, whenever everybody was gathering up, and he built up this force, this very small, tight-knit group of men that fought with him and became very valiant. And if you go through and you read chapter 39, you see where these guys were, they would make Delta Force, Navy SEALs. I mean, when you compare to their courage, one killing a lion with his bare hands, one man standing and fighting so long with the sword and killing hundreds of people of the Philistines. And these guys had fought for David. They were loyal to David. And Uriah is one of them. That's something important to remember. So where's David at? Well, one of the things with the Orient homes in that day and age was, when they didn't have air conditioning. So if you wanted to find a cool place, remember, this is in the spring when the kings usually go out to war. And so as, the weather, you get up, you go up high where the breeze is, and you have a pretty good overlook. So he's on top of his house after relaxing and looks down and he sees this beautiful woman that's bathing. And we'll talk about a lot more. There's some things about this that, we initially can see right away. We'll come back and start to wrap more of these up. So David, when he sees that, he doesn't stop there. That's one of the problems we see that he has, is he doesn't stop there. He actually goes the next step, in other words, that I think is what's going to get him in trouble. So David sent messengers, and he took her, and she came to him, and he laid with her. Now she had been purifying herself from uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent a message to David, I am pregnant. Oops. So he sees this woman. She is very beautiful. So we know that he's seeing her not in just a respectful, she just has this natural beauty, but he sees her bathing, so we know that she's nude. So he's looking at her in her nudity and having this desire, and then turns around and then he inquires about her. So you see the progression as we come along. First he sees her, instead of just turning away, he then decides and makes that, oh wow, she is really beautiful. Then he asks, well, who is she? Now, if she wasn't married, it's one thing, but it doesn't seem to stop him, because when they tell him who she is, and that she is the wife of Uriah, David knows Uriah. He's not just an average guy that's out there fighting for him. This is a man of valor, a man that has been with him from the beginning. And it doesn't seem to matter to David. David has no respect. And that's the thing with sin that we see, is that, sin will not stop. It's all about self. And that's something that even James talks about in James 1, chapter 1, starting about 14 there. We see where it says, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. When then the desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So there's the formula. We see that with David here, don't we? Where, it started out with the temptation. He looked down, he saw this beautiful woman unclothed, and so it starts. But is there a problem with her bathing without clothes on? No. And, I think it's kind of twisted, because I have heard some people try to say, well, she shouldn't have been bathing on top of her roof, that it was her fault, that somehow she's to blame in this. We're going to get to this aspect when we talk about Bathsheba, because there's a lot of things that have been, I think, brought down pretty heavy on her, and that somehow she has a part of this. No. I don't think she's a temptress. I don't think she was out there trying to seduce on, hey, that's the king's house up there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, go up there and I'm going to unclothe myself. And I know when he comes out and walks around, and so I'll be naked when he gets out there, and then he's going to desire me. And no, that's going way too far. When we start trying to impugn this on her and trying to make her guilty when it's David. Because even if she was doing that, he didn't have to keep looking. He didn't have to take the next step. And that next step was, who is she? Does it matter? She's a woman that's naked, and you shouldn't have been staring at her and having those thoughts about her. You should have stopped. You should have walked inside. But he walked inside and said, hey, who's that woman out there, And so they tell him. And then when he finds out that she's married, and she's not married to just anybody, she's married to one of his closest warriors. Doesn't stop. He says, sends a messenger, bring her. Now, in one of the things that is interesting, you may have seen when he says this here about in verse 4, it says, now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanliness. When you look at the Mosaic law, and when a woman would menstruate, there was a certain period of time that she was considered unclean, and then there were so many days afterwards that she had to, a part of what you call the purifying themselves and making sure that there's not any uncleanliness and such. So what that does is it tells us that it marks the date of pregnancy. There's no way, the amount of time that they have been down, that Uriah has been away from his wife, and then for her to have her last menstrual cycle, it's kind of like, this is the pregnancy test. This is saying this, she was not pregnant, guys. So you can't sit there, in other words, for example, it's in a parentheses, but if you were to take that out, you could say, well, maybe it wasn't David's. No, what the writer is saying, she was not pregnant. David had sex with her, and now she then became pregnant. There is no doubt. But the progression of sin is what we find is the pattern. that David fell for, that we all fall for. The first part in back over in James 1 and 13 is describing the idea that somehow that sin at times we feel that it's God's fault, that somehow God is responsible for this. And James then explains, he goes, no, 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 no. It's when you're tempted. So what tempts you? Well, I'll tell you right now, when I walk by chocolate cake or brownies, man, it's tempting. When I smell the chili plant cooking and preparing that chili, that red chili, and it blows across town, oh, I don't even know what I want to eat. But there's something about the smell of chili in the fall. Man, it tempts me. And those temptations are around what the stimulus has. So, if I have a temptation, I look down at chocolate, it's because I have a sweet tooth. You get my point? The temptation is something in which I have a desire for that then is going to grow. We all have temptations. They're not, just because you have temptations mean they're all sinful either. I'm tempted and I have a brownie. I eat it. Maybe I'm not fat. Let's just say I'm not. I'm healthy. I'm not a diabetic. I was tempted and I ate it. Doesn't mean it's a sin. There's a lot of things. So the temptation in of itself also is not a sin. It's what the passion or desire that's behind this temptation that is creating the problem. And this one is sexual. It's a lustful desire for her. And so once it has that, and that own desire, we see that once it's conceived, and which means, in other words, it comes out from the heart and then acted upon, then it births sin. And then, of course, we know spiritual death is what happens next. So he's got a problem, doesn't he? So she's pregnant. And that's the only thing, by the way, that we ever hear from Bathsheba. This is it. That's it. A message from her to David. I'm pregnant. That's it. It's the only voice she ever has in all of this story, all of the Bible. So David has this problem. So he comes up with a solution. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house, wash your feet. And Uriah went out from the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. So, he brings him back. He first tells Joab, hey, I want Uriah to come back. And then he makes this small talk. This is where you see, I think, the insidiousness, the horrific aspect of sin, the two-facedness of having the man that you have committed adultery with, with his wife sitting there before you, and you know that the only reason you're talking to him is because you have committed a sin. You buy into it. This is something that's a part of the problem with sin, is that once you have committed it, and once spiritual death or the sin has been brought out, you have to then carry through. If you don't repent, then you start to go into this act like David is doing and trying to, conceal and do everything he can to cover it up. But to look at him and say, oh, hey, how's everybody going? How's the war going? Well, first off, David, you should be there. you should know what's going on, and then after he has that little quick small talk, which seems like, if I was Uriah, I'd say, wow, you brought me all the way from Ammon to ask me that. Isn't there messengers? I'm sorry. I just think Uriah would have started kind of thinking like, what, is there more here? What's going on? Why would you just want to know and have you just talk to me like this? Yeah, okay, I'm one of your mighty men of warrior. But, when we're in the middle of a battle and we're trying to overthrow this city, you've never done this before. I doubt that David ever did that. And if he did, it was by a messenger, a person of insignificance that served Joab, and Joab would send the messenger. But to be called up by name, right away. The boss wants to see you, Ron. What? He wants, what does he want with me? And then he just says, oh, hey, how you doing? What's going on? And then he tries to encourage him to go home because he knows what he wants him to do. He wants him to go home and to have, intimate relationships with his wife. And then he can try to push this off as, that, oh, that's how she got pregnant. But there's a problem. There's a problem with this that he doesn't foresee. But Uriah slept on the floor of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. Oh. This is already starting to show the character of Uriah. And it's being pitted against David's heart because he figured, well, if he's a normal man and he's been away from his wife so long and under this false pretense of, I want some information, and now it's in the evening, why don't you just go on home? We'll talk tomorrow. And then why don't you go back to your wife? And you notice that he even sends a present. And we don't know what it is, but basically what he's doing is trying to encourage whatever it was, the present that he sends with Uriah, or goes and follows him down and out, thinks he's going to be able to take that home and maybe show that as an excitement. Look what the king gave us, honey. He doesn't do it, does he? So that starts. And that's another part of the progression of sin, is that you can try to cover it up, but lies, you have to keep lying. When you start breaking God's laws, you start breaking more of them, you start buying into it, and it's not going to go as you planned. There's only one way that you fix this. There's only one way, and that's by repenting of it, confessing your sin, and you got to deal with the consequences of it. And until then, you're just going to keep spinning and spinning the sin and all of these poor choices all the way around. So in the morning, we see that it didn't happen the way David. And so starting in 10, when they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a long journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Again, the fact that he didn't go home when he had permission from the king. I mean, who would have blamed him, right? I mean, this is what's amazing to me too, is it's like you got word from the king. His loyalty is far greater spiritually to his men and to the mission and to God than it is to going home and satisfying himself. He is thinking of everybody else. And this is the opposite of what's going on here with David. David is thinking of only himself and nobody else. Uriah is thinking of all the men that are back in the battlefield. And he even brings up the ark of the Lord, which, what's the ark of the Lord? That's where the Lord's at. And when he says booths, that's a tent. So they're out there living in tents. Nobody's getting to have any time with their spouses and stuff. No, Lord, as long as your soul lives, I'm not going to do this thing. So that didn't go so well, did it? And so, that's something that we see, like I said, where you just continue to build and dig your hole and pile it on and pile it on. And so David then tries to come up with a second solution. In verse 12, then David said to Uriah, remain here today, and also tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. But he did not go down to his house. So, okay, solution 2 is not working too good, is it? So what he was hoping was, well, I'll get him drunk, and then he will have a desire to go home and spend time with his wife. Didn't work. So he's still in that same. So now he's got a next solution, and that's to move it even further. So he first starts out by just saying, "Come home, go have time with your wife, some little R&R," and then he says, "Okay, that didn't work, so now I'm going to get him drunk. Okay, that didn't work, so now he has to move it even further and down this, just digressing." So in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, and he sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die." Wow. It's one thing to plot to kill somebody, but then to write it in a letter and hand it to the man and have him carry his own letter of execution to back with you. I think it shows his loyalty in his dedication that he won't even open or peek into the letter. He just takes this letter that's going to condemn him to death and brings it down there and delivers it right into the hand of Joab. That's why this is one of the worst stories in the Bible, especially coming from a man of God that does so many things that are so beautiful and spiritual, and then writes such beautiful psalms, and then to sit and have this level of vileness that he can bring out. So starting in 16, "And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there would be valiant men. And the men of the city came out, and they fought with Joab. And some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died." Problem solved, right? Problem solved. He's gone. Now, in this, one of the things that he described, Joab, which I think also is, can you imagine Uriah shows up? "How's your trip?" "Oh, it was good, hung out a while. King just asked me how I was doing, and, and had a little wine, and then, oh, here's this letter. He told me to give this to you." And then I can see Joab opening it up and reading it going, "You just carried your death sentence all the way from Jerusalem." Think about it. What would it be like to receive something like that from the king? And this also shows, why would Joab carry this out? This is not right. This is wrong. And so now David's also weakened him with the Joab. Joab is not the greatest of confidants. Remember, he's got some bad, history as far as his moral character at times. And what you've done now, and this happens in sin, is you will make strange bedfellows with others that can also cause you problems. And by you, David, sitting there and involving Joab, which really is the only one you could trust, but you shouldn't, now he has to be sitting there thinking to himself, "Okay, he had me send Uriah back to Jerusalem. He's sending back with a letter that basically tells me to murder him. There's something the king is doing. The king is up to something. Who's going to stop him, though? Who's going to stop the king?" That's one of the problems with sin as well, is that, somebody has to have the moral courage to say, "Whoa, here, Uriah, come here. I got a letter for the king here." And write a letter and seal it and say, "Here, take this one back to the king. Okay, Uriah?" Imagine if Uriah would have went back to Jerusalem with a letter from Joab, and then David opened it up and says, "Are you kidding me? I'm not murdering this guy. He's innocent. What are you thinking of?" I think it's, I don't know. It's very speculative, but That to me would have been the appropriate action, would be for Joab to go, no, this is not righteous. I don't know what you're doing up there, king. First off, you shouldn't be back there. Joab knows that. And you're doing something and you've got yourself in trouble. The only thing that, if you're a thinking man and it's this guy, there's nothing he's done. He's somebody that's very close of all of the valiant men, including Joab, Uriah, and all the other 37 men. It's got to be something really serious that the king's got himself into trouble with. And that has to be probably, I think you could come and say there's something, maybe his wife or something. I don't know. I'm not sure how far Joab. But the point is, Joab should have stopped it. He should have said no. And I think the best way would have been to write a letter, put it back in Joab's hand, and send it back by Uriah's hand. And have Uriah hand that letter back to him and let David see Uriah standing there while he read this letter and say, no, I'm not going to murder him. I don't know, maybe. But Joab didn't. Joab went ahead and it shows a level of insensitivity. And so he follows through. He goes ahead and places him in. Now, the place apparently was a strong point that they shouldn't have been attacking. There's certain places that that if you try to attack, your losses are going to be high and you're going to be accountable. Just like in the Civil War, there were a lot of really bad generals, and they at times would throw thousands of soldiers into really murdering them in horrible decisions. And they, Lincoln, eventually would hold them accountable. And sometimes the chain of command would go, what are you doing? You lost 20,000 men in one battle in one day. So this is not something tactically that Joab would do. What the message is coming from David is attack a strong spot. Attack a place where you're going to have an intense battle. And that's exactly what Joab did. He knew exactly where to poke that front line and send those men in, and knowing that the valiant men, that's what it's talking about in verse 16, is that he knew there were valiant men. This is the strong point. This is where the soldiers that are really trained well will come out and battle us and fight us back. And it happened exactly as planned. He was very successful in that. So now he's got to get the message back over to David. So let's go ahead and read starting in 18. When Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger arises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died in Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. So that's the key word, isn't it? The key word here is, if he gets upset, what Joab's doing is really kind of covering himself. Because what he's expressing here is he's saying that he knows the king could say, hey, that was dumb. And yes, okay, Joab understands he got a message to do this. But what if for some reason David all of a sudden finds out about this attack and the loss of men in such a wasted attack that he becomes angered? And so if he responds, and he's given a historical point when at one time the commander of forces, Abimelech, had come up to the city wall and they were besieging it, and a woman dropped this huge stone down on top of his head and killed him. And so, so he's already thinking through if David becomes angry with this. But then he says, after he gets mad and he gets all upset, then slide this in. Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Wink, wink. And that should be it. So now we have the messenger arrives, and he arrives with the news, starting at 22. So the messenger went, and he came and he told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." And David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him." So the best thing that he can say to him is, what? You know, things happen. It's okay. You know, the people die. It's all right. And that's where the answer going back to Joab would be, good job. Good job. Encouraging. The complexity of the way sin works, it's not complex, but it starts to embed itself in layers of your life that involves others, that become a part of that sin. And there are people around you that should probably stand up and say, what are you doing? They don't. They actually will end up being a part of it or helping you. And that's what I see in this part of the story. And just the insensitivity of David is mind-blowing compared to the sensitivity that he has shown in the past. His passion for those who are less fortunate. If you'll recall back when he was in the wilderness, that he learned that the Philistines had come in and were attacking and killing this one city and taking their food. And he wasn't even responsible. He was trying to hide himself from Saul, the king. The king's men should have been taking care of these people. And he came out of hiding and defended them. And several other things we see where he had this great sensitivity. But in this, because of sin, no. You just see how one of the most spiritual men can just turn into one of the worst type of persons that you couldn't imagine is there. The potential, in other words, for no matter how good you are, is there to be very evil. That's a warning to everybody, that there's nobody that's is going to be immune from sin, from the lust, the desire that will start, the temptation, that progression that will come on, unless we stop it ourselves. And if we don't, just like what James said, it's going to give birth to sin, and sin then is going to bring death. And you will never, honestly, fully recover from it. There's going to be consequences. Now, maybe it's not such a violent sin. Maybe it's just a little lie. But a lie shakes the confidence in those in whom you've lied to. So even the simplest of sins, they still have consequences that you're going to have to deal with, instead of trying to fight that temptation. And I'm not sitting there saying that I've stopped them. I just know that the same process, it happens to us all. So, but just the way he says it nonchalant just is really disturbing to me, the way he says it about, the sword, some die, So then in 26, verse 26, and when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. When we think about now, he's not only brought Bathsheba into this by this sexual relationship, and it seems like it's something that's just very willing, but in the job place in America today, in Hollywood and corporations all over this country, we see where that men in power have manipulated women and basically had had sexual relationships with him when it wasn't something they wanted, but they knew that they had to do so. And when you think about that culture and that time, I mean, who's going to say no to the king? So it's easy to say, well, it takes two to tango, that, she must have been in agreement to it. That is, again, I think a very twisted perspective to try to put onto Bathsheba, is to try to say, well, I mean, she could have said no. Really? No, she couldn't have said no. It wasn't that type of a culture. And the fact that I thought was interesting is the way 26, when she hears about this, she mourned for him. She really loved him. And I bet some of that regret was the fact that, I don't know if she's privy to the plot, but even if she's not, she lost a husband and she is pregnant by another man's wife. What is she going to do now? And if anybody's smart, they're going to sit there and go, let's see, the army of Israel's been in Ammon for 9 months now, and you're 2 months pregnant. But he never came to the house. You haven't seen him then. So just think about the panic in her mind. That isn't working out. She is exposed as far as the culture. And then what is the punishment for adultery? It's a capital offense, isn't it? It's death. So here she is, an adulteress. He's the king. Mel Brooks, I can't remember what movie it was. It just keeps ringing in my head every time I think of David in this situation about, he would go around in this comedy saying, it's good to be the king. It's good to be the king, because you're the top dog. Nobody's going to say anything to you about it. And this brings us back to David. And one of the biggest things that we see, I think, as a fault in David is his sexual desire. He could not keep in check. Let's go back, when we look at the wives that he has. In First Chronicles, we see all the wives that are listed there. 7 wives. Now, you notice these are the ones listed in First Chronicles chapter 3. Are they all listed there? There's one missing, huh? There's one missing there, and it's Michal. And it's kind of baffling. They don't really understand why the Chronicle, whoever wrote it, would have left her out. But the last time we hear of her is when David was bringing the ark back into Jerusalem. She was very humiliated by his actions, dancing around, and David rebukes her. And at the end of the encounter there, we learn that she ends up never having a child. In Chronicles is listing, the genealogy. So with Michal, there is none to go forward from her, but these other wives are there. So let's come back and look at his family tree, which I'm not sure you can see. Most of this is a mess because of David. This is a family bush. This ain't no tree. When I look at this, it's like, and when you start to look at the wives that he brought while he was in Hebron, before he united the kingdom together, he had all these wives. And in Jerusalem, he ends up gaining another wife. So he ends up technically with 8 wives. And that's not all. He ends up with 10 concubines. 10 concubines. This kind of brings up the discussion when we talk about polygamy. And there are religions today. There's one particularly, certain divisions of the Mormon church, but the Mormon church believes in polygamy and multiple wives, and they look at the Old Testament, and it's really hard because there's nothing in the Mosaic law that ever authorizes that a man should have more than one wife. You go all the way back, the mention of it is, the idea of one man, one woman, And then when we come into the Mosaic law, it talks about adultery, that if a woman or a man has a relationship outside of that bond, it's adultery. So I've never really been able to understand why it was being permitted. There's nothing, honestly, that scripturally ever says that God endorsed, I'm going to say it that way, that God ever approved of this. And every time, if you look, when you have a wife and a concubine, it's a mess. There's nothing but problems with the concubine. And you look at this family tree and the number of children that he has, the number of wives that he has. I mean, just in Hebron alone, 7.5 years, I think, well, if you count, he ends up with 5 wives. Well, I think about 4 or 5 wives just within that 7-year period. What are they for? I mean, what are they needed? What do you need in these women? You know, he only has one child per each one of those while he's down there. He has 6 sons down in Hebron. I understand a king needs a dynasty, you need children, but this just points out that this idea of sexual desire is a real flaw in his character. And then to have 10 concubines means, he's got 18, well, knock out Michael, 17 women. 17 women that he's having some form at some point in time. I don't know how often or how close he was to all of them, but that he is having intimate sexual relationship with one of them or another. It's not right. I mean, it's a power thing. And when you look at that culture in that day and age, that was wrong. I mean, we look back at it now and we can see what was going on. And David is going to reap the bitter fruit of what he is doing here. And it is going to come back with a vengeance from this point on. And we're going to see that as it happens in chapter 12 next week. So I like to share with you, if you have some thoughts on what you think about this at this time. Yeah, go ahead, Becky.
Well, there's a couple points. I was wondering if Bathsheba told the messengers no, what would happen to her? But whatever the king asks, the king gets. So I don't think that Bathsheba really had a choice in the matter of them saying you've got to go see David. She might have even thought that David was going to tell her something about Uriah. We don't know. The other thing is, when we're talking about what the king wants, the king gets. And so with Joab getting this letter, what if he didn't do what the king said? It probably would be he would be killed.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, what the king wants, the king gets. And then with in verse 21, where it says Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth, was it not a woman who cast a piece of stone on him from the wall so that he died? But he didn't die from that stone. She hit him, and he was near death, and he asked someone else to go and kill him, one of his own men to kill him, because he said, I don't want it being known that I was killed by a woman. So, in Judges 9, it tells us about that. And then in verse 27, but when it says, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So God was not upset with Bathsheba. He was upset with David.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying that I don't think Bathsheba had a chance to say no to the king.
I agree with you completely. I think this was, when we look at, like I said, some of the Hollywood elites today, the people, men in power, and the advantages they've taken with women, and in a lot of ways, there's some that did say no, and they lost their acting careers. There's a lot of women, I'm sure, that there's can't say millions, but thousands upon thousands, I bet, of women that had been put into a position to where, that it was an unsaid thing that you need to provide me sexual, satisfaction, or I'm not going to give you what you want, or you're in jeopardy, or you're in peril. And that's such a horrific power, that people hold. And it's not very frequent, but there are some women, predator women too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's, I mean, I think predominantly because of the positions of power that men have been in, especially in our country, and when we go back to this historical point, um, they were the ones in power. But when you have somebody that has that type of power where they're unchecked, it's you can't stop them. And Bathsheba is a victim. She is a victim in all of this, and I think that's why that you see that there's some pity from God on Bathsheba, because guess who her son's gonna be, right?
Solomon.
Solomon, and he's not even the oldest. He's not the one. We're going to find that out when David dies, at the end of his life, that when the transition of power starts to happen, the son that should, by all rights, take over and rule as king, it's not him. It's Solomon. It's Bathsheba's son. And at the end of his life, he is showing loyalty and a lot more endearment to Bathsheba than anyone. He listens to her. So, but we're gonna see. It's gonna get uglier from here. And next week we'll look at the revelation of it, the way it comes out, and how long it took, that how deep that he buried this sin within himself. And then I'm going to bring up some of the Psalms that he wrote that reflect the emotional side that he says that he felt as he was going through that. And so no matter how calloused you are, honestly, you can't get it. Aline says, Aline says perhaps part of the mercy shown David and Bathsheba was because of Bathsheba. So, in other words, I think what I'm understanding that you're saying is that because of some mercy we're going to see that he's given is possibly because of Bathsheba. Um, I think, Aline, honestly, the biggest one we're going to see is the fact that he repented. Bam. I mean, when it hit him, it changed him. Whereas when you look at Saul, when Samuel confronted Saul, when he would sin, he made excuses. So, but I think the mercy towards Bathsheba in her life, and then because of Solomon, is because of the sinfulness and the way that she was treated in this. Yes.
And then this also reminds me of Paul when he was regretting what he had done to the Christians, taking them out and killing them. He just was sorrowful his whole life. And now this is like David. David is sorrowful also for what he has done. And that's why he laments in the Psalms.
Yeah, this is going to be his thorn. This is going to be his thorn.
Agrees.
Yeah, he's not going to get over this. This is something that he's going to have. And that's what I mean about, yes, can you be forgiven? Absolutely. David not only committed adultery, but he's responsible for 2 deaths, 2 of them. His son by Bathsheba and Uriah. He is responsible for them dying. And then he had committed adultery. And then he buried it. And he didn't repent of it. And he had plenty of time, plenty of things that he should have known. And a man that's so spiritual as David, I think that what we're going to see next week is when Nathan comes to him and brings this out, God was getting ready to kill him. If the next words out of David's mouth hadn't have been, I have sinned, God was going to kill him. He was going to strike him down right there. That's how angry God was with him. Because right after he then says, I have sinned, and he confesses, then Nathan says, you are not going to die now. So I get, and so that's how angry that it gets with God, because he just buries his sin. All right, well, everybody, good discussions. I guess it wasn't too horrible for the class, and this is not the format I necessarily want to use. And but hey, if we've got technical problems and we got to make a shift, and I'll shift this direction, and we'll use it this way. I didn't want to just stop the class. Too many times we've had to do that, so we'll
Thank you
still.
for doing it,
What's that?
Thank you for doing it this way,
You're
so
welcome.
we can continue on.
Yeah, I'm tired of letting it stop, and so this Friday morning, this is the way that it works. So for the podcast and Bible study on Friday morning at 10, we'll be fine. It gives me 3 days to try to figure out the camera problem, and we'll get that fixed and move along. But I appreciate everybody who joined me. Looks like we've got a pretty good number out there live streaming, joining us, being with us, and we got about 5 people here with us watching. So in the auditorium. So I hope that it was a good class. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys. Hopefully, be here Friday morning. Then we'll get to do that. All right. We'll see you later.